Chapter 7. Campsite. The cubs stood a long while, silently reviewing the drifting boat. No other craft now was visible on the river, and no one appeared aware of their plight. "Maybe I could swim out there before the boat moves further downstream," Dan proposed, estimating the distance. "Not on your life," Brad promptly vetoed that suggestion. "You're an expert swimmer and might make it, but we're taking no chances. We're already messed things up enough." "Mr. Holloway warned us a storm might blow up," Dan added, kicking disgustingly at the wet sand. "We'd have been more alert if we wouldn't have been so interested in the raft and the motorboat. Mr. Holloway just had his boat repaired too. Now if it sinks or rams into something, we have no one to blame except ourselves." Dan's gaze had focused upon a man's large footprint visible in the sand. "Say, maybe we do have someone else to blame besides ourselves," he cried. "Look at that!" Brad stared at the footprints, which plainly had been made since the cubs had pulled their boat up on the shore. Half protected from the rain by a piece of driftwood, it remained the only mark on an otherwise smooth beach. "Someone's been here since we were," he claimed, stooping to examine the shoe print. "And that someone must have set our boat free to drift, Brad." "Jabberwocky?" "Could be, Brad. He took a dislike to me, I know." "Even so, it would be contemptible trick. I hate to think he'd do it." "Who else is on the island?" "No one so far as I know," Brad replied, his eyes troubled. "Well, it's a relief to know that the boat didn't drift off due to our own carelessness. Even so, we're in a jam." Dan nodded, his face sober. The afternoon had grown dark and night would come up on earlier than usual. When the sailboat failed to return to the clubhouse, he knew Mr. Holloway would be worried. "We'll be picked up eventually," he said, shivering in his wet clothing. "Meanwhile, we're in for an unfortunate time of it." "Let's find Jabberwocky's place," Brad proposed. "He might be willing to pick up our boat with his raft, or at least take us ashore." "Think he'd do it? After the way he set our boat loose?" "We may suspect he did it, but it could have been someone else," Dan said. "Anyway, isn't it better than standing here?" "Sure," Dan agreed. "It's our only chance." From the beach, the boys could see no building on the island. However, from previous sails in the locality, they knew that the old hotel building was situated in a heavily wooded section to the north. Setting off diagonally through a thicket of saplings, they found a trail which led in the direction they wished to go. After wandering through a patch of weeds and rushes, they came to waist deep. They emerged into an area of thin green turf. Beyond that, they spied the old hotel, a sprawling building with grimy windows and broken shutters. Unpainted in recent years, it had a look of utter abandonment. The foundation had crumbled in many places and the roof sagged. Broken window panes in the upper windows had not been replaced. "Why, this place looks deserted," Dan said in disappointment. "Then why is smoke coming from the chimney?" Brad demanded. Trained as a scout to be observing, he noticed the blue-white wisps curling from the rear of the building. "You're right. Someone must be there. Let's knock." They pushed on, circling the old building. Brad rapped on the rear door. There was no answer. He pounded. Still no one came to the door. Glancing upward, however, Dan fancied he saw a face at a dirt-streaked window almost directly overhead. Before he could be sure, the shadow was gone. "It's no use," Brad said, after rapping again on the door. "Someone must be living here, but the place seems to be deserted now." "Either that or Jabberwocky's hiding out. I thought I saw a face at that window." "Where, Dan?" The younger boy indicated the window. "No one's there now," Brad said, "but I think you may be right. Ever since we came here, I've had a feeling we're being watched. There's something about this place I don't like." Convinced they were to obtain no help from the caretaker, the boys sought an easier route back to the beach. Not far from the rear of the hotel, they noticed an abandoned pier which had fallen into decay. Tied to it was the same raft they'd observed earlier that afternoon. Further down the shore extended a long stretch of loose sand which gradually merged into turf and wooded area. Wonder if that tale Mr. Hatfield told us about the tunnel is true. Brad speculated as they dog-trotted along. No evidence of it anywhere around here. Without seeing anyone, the boys struck across the dunes and finally emerged on the beach, not far from where they had first taken refuge. Gazing downriver, they sought to determine the position of the drifting boat. To their astonishment, it was nowhere to be seen. "Well, for crying out loud!" Dan yiped. "Now, what became of it? How could that boat be drifted out of sight so fast?" "It couldn't. Either someone has hauled it in or what?" Dan demanded as his companion broke off. Instead of answering, Brad pointed far upstream. The missing sailboat had been taken in tow by a motor launch from the yacht club. "There goes our boat now, Dan, and with it our chance for rescue. Let's yell. Maybe we can attract their attention." In unison, the boys shouted and waved their arms. Running far down the beach, they watched the receding launch anxiously. "They see us," Brad cried in relief. "She's turning around." True to his observation, the motor craft had come about. With the sailboat still in tow, it set a direct course for the island. "Lucky break for us," Brad mumbled in relief. "I had visions of spending the night on this place." Within a few minutes, the launch came close to the island. Brad and Dan saw then that Mr. Hatfield was at the wheel, accompanied by Midge, Red, and Chips. The owner of the launch, a man they did not know, also was in the boat. The cub leader eased the craft as near shore as he could. When the launch could approach no closer without grounding, he advised Brad and Dan to wait out. Eager hands pulled them over the side to the launch. "We've been worried about you," Mr. Hatfield said, wrapping his coat about Dan. "Didn't Midge's father warn you to remain close to the clubhouse?" "He did, sir. We meant to carry out his orders, but a lot happened." "We'll discuss that later, Dan. The important thing is that you're both safe. By the way, meet Mr. Fisher." Dan and Brad grasped the launch owner's horny hand, expressing gratitude for the rescue. From him, they learned that their drifting boat had been sighted by Midge from the cave. The club had summoned Mr. Hatfield, who had sought the help of Mr. Fisher in finding them. "You and Brad scared us out of our year's growth," Chips said accusingly. "Seeing that empty boat made us think you might have drowned." "Me drown?" Dan snorted. "You may have been a crack swimmer, but accidents do occur," Mr. Hatfield interposed. "Suppose you tell us what happened that caused you to sail so far from the clubhouse." Together, Dan and Brad explained how their attention had been drawn to the raft and motorboat. "The storm struck us unexpectedly," Brad added. "We barely had time to get the sail down." "I'm glad you managed that," Mr. Hatfield approved. "The wind didn't last long, but it was strong when it came. If it had hit you with the sails up, the dinghy probably would have capsized." "We made Skeleton Island," Dan took up the account. "After beaching the boat, we dashed back into the bushes to get out of the rain. When we returned to the beach, our boat was gone." "Oh, Dan," Mr. Hatfield sighed, "how many times have I warned the cubs always to pull the boat beyond the reach of the waves?" "We did, sir. Someone deliberately set the dinghy loose." Mr. Hatfield braced himself as the launch swung sharply around a buoy which marked the river shoal. "Your boat was set loose?" he demanded. "Are you sure, Dan?" "Well, we found a man's footprint in the sand. That boat couldn't have broken away by itself." "We have an idea who did it," Brad added. "Let's mention no names," Mr. Hatfield said quickly. "That is, not unless you're certain." Being unable to prove that it was Japowski who had shoved their boat from the beach, Dan and Brad remained silent. "I know you believe you were careful about the boat," Mr. Hatfield said. "Perhaps you were. On the other hand, you might have been mistaken." "Hardly," commented Brad in quiet protest. "Bear in mind that Mr. Mannheim is the owner of the island, and he has been very friendly to the Scouts and Cubs. He has given permission for us to camp on Skeleton Island this weekend. Now, if wild accusations should reach his ears, it might prove embarrassing to say the least." Brad and Dan grasped the idea that Mr. Hatfield intended to convey. "After all, maybe we were mistaken," Brad grinned. "Those waves were pretty big." No more was said about the sailboat mishap at that time, but later at the cave the two boys told Mr. Hatfield why they had been so interested in the raft operator's contact with the motorboat. "It seemed queer. The men in the motorboat would signal," Dan remarked. "We figure it must have been Jabowski who ferried across the river to meet them. No one else appears to be living on that island." "We'll know more about Skeleton Island after this weekend," Mr. Hatfield remarked. "The camping trip should give us an opportunity to see that everything is satisfactory before the property is purchased." "Then you think something queer may be going on out there?" Brad demanded alertly. Mr. Hatfield smiled and did not answer the question directly. "Oh, no one can tell," he replied. No use exciting the Cubs in any case, so not a word of this to any other boys." During the remainder of the week, preparations for the camping trip kept Dan and Brad so busy they hardly had time to think of possible mysteries at Skeleton Island. However, unknown to them, Mr. Hatfield was more disturbed by the sailboat incident than he cared to admit. On 2 occasions, he telephoned Mr. Mannheim, intending to inquire as to any possible intruders on Skeleton Island. He was informed that the island owner was out of the city and would not return before Saturday. Though Brad and Dan were careful to say nothing of their unfortunate experience on Skeleton Island, the other Cubs guessed that there was more to the story than they had been told. "Come on, give," Midge urged. "I know you boys are too smart to let the boat get away from you, even in a storm." "Nothing to report," Dan replied with a wide grin. His silence only made the Cubs more curious. They discussed the proposed camping trip at great length, building up elements of mystery and adventure. And, to make their rivals, the Cubs of Den 1, envious, they passed out hints that something queer already had happened there. In due time, these rumors reached the ears of Ross Langdon. Still smarting from his defeat in the swim meet, he told his buddies that he intended to have a little wholesome fun at Dan Carter's expense. "Just to be sure it's fun and not revenge," a fellow Cub warned him. "Seems to me you've been a sorehead ever since you lost that race." "Who lost a race?" Ross retorted. "I was robbed." Unaware that Rob was plotting revenge, Dan continued to practice his swimming faithfully at the Y pool. Between times, he slaved on the coded message left by Jacques, but try as he would, he could not decipher it. "When it comes to solving a puzzle, I'm a dud," Dan remarked one afternoon as he and Brad lounged in the cave. "And that reminds me, we've heard nothing more about Paper Bag Eddie or his friend Fagin. You know, that fellow hooked up with a man of Eddie's shady reputation makes me wonder if he could have had any part in the fur theft," Brad said thoughtfully. "I've not seen a word in the paper lately about any hauls by the river pirates." "Neither have I, Brad. That robbery was pulled off just about the same time of night Mr. Holloway's boat was hit." "Sure, that's what I've been thinking, Dan. Why not drop around and talk to Hank Hawkins? He may have heard of this bird Fagin." Having nothing more pressing to do, Dan agreed to the proposal. The boys found the warehouse man at the dock chatting with his friend Joe Matt. The seeing-eye dog, upon sighting Dan, began to strain on his leash. Only after the blind man had restrained the animal were the Cubs able to enter the warehouse. For a while the conversation centered on the river commerce. Then presently Dan and Brad steered into the topic of river pirates. "I wish the police would get busy to catch these pug uglies that have been making so much trouble along the waterfront," Hank said irritably. "Trouble is, they're slick operators. Have you lost any shipments lately? Joe Matt inquired. Not since the furs were snatched. All the same, I'm keeping my fingers crossed. You don't think the river pirates would strike twice in the same area, the blind man scoffed, especially with police on the lookout? I wouldn't put anything past those boys, Hank retorted as he studied a bill of lading. I'm taking no chances. Not with another valuable shipment due any day. Another box of furs? That's right. Coming through around the 24th, the blind man remarked casually. That happens to be the date, Hank admitted, gazing at the other rather sharply. But I don't remember saying anything about it. Fact is, you told me the other day. Then it was a slip of the tongue, Hank replied. You'll do me a favor and not speak of that day. It's confidential information. Sorry, Joe Matt apologized. I didn't know that you were under secret orders about it. Every precaution is being taken to safeguard the shipment. Special police guards will be on the docks. I've got nothing to worry about, and yet I do anyhow. You're jittery, the blind man said, starting away. We'll see you later. Come on, Rudy. After he had trapped off down the dock, Brad and Dan lingered a few minutes longer. Hank, however, seemed preoccupied. Dan asked him if he knew any sailors by the name of Frisk Fagan. No, I don't, he answered, a trifle irritable. Now I wish you boys wouldn't pester me. I got work to do. Thus dismayed, Brad and Dan took themselves off. Hank was out of sorts because we overheard Joe Matt mention that 24 shipping date, Dan remarked as they tramped along together. Say, that's funny. What is it, Dan? Those two dates being the same. What two dates? Don't you recall? Dan demanded excitedly. That coded message Jock had in his pocket mentioned the 24th. The note included the number 24, Brad admitted. But what does that prove? Nothing, perhaps. Then again, it may mean plenty. Dan spoke with quiet conviction. I know one thing. I'm really going to work on that message. I'll break that code if it's humanly possible. Do, 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 do.